While much of the news has been focused on President Trump's latest round of tariffs, steep duties on trucks, furniture, cabinets, and even certain pharmaceutical drugs, a quieter but potentially more important shift is happening in the background. Recent government data shows that major foreign investors are beginning to pull back from putting their money into the United States. To understand why this matters, it helps to look at how foreign investment has shaped the American economy. For decades, the U.S. has been able to run large budget deficits year after year, something few other countries could survive, largely because the rest of the world was willing to finance it. Back in 1980, the national debt was under $1 trillion. By 2000, it had grown to $5 trillion. After the 2008 financial crisis, it doubled again, reaching $10 trillion. The pandemic pushed it past $20 trillion, and by 2025, the debt has climbed to more than $35 trillion, with no sign of slowing down. This enormous borrowing was possible because U.S. Treasury bonds became the bedrock of global finance. They were seen as the safest, most reliable investment, so countries around the world kept buying them. In many ways, it allowed America to live beyond its means, with foreign governments covering the difference. China was the biggest player in this system. During the 2000s and 2010s, as American consumers bought Chinese goods in huge volumes, China used its profits to purchase U.S. debt. At one point, Beijing held more than $1.3 trillion in treasury bonds, making it Washington's largest foreign creditor. Other countries, including Japan, Canada, and Brazil, also built up massive holdings. Altogether, foreign governments own nearly a third of America's total debt. It was an unusual partnership. The U.S. depended on foreign money to sustain its spending, while other nations relied on America's economy as a safe place to park their wealth. For decades, the U.S. ran budget deficits while the rest of the world paid the bill. America consumed, others produced. The U.S. printed bonds, and global investors treated them as if they were gold. It looked like a system that could never break. But rising debt and growing political tension can change the equation. And that's exactly what the most recent Treasury report shows. In July 2025, three of the world's biggest economies, Canada, China, and Brazil, sold off nearly $100 billion in U.S. government debt in a single month. It was one of the sharpest coordinated pullbacks in years. This wasn't just a small adjustment. It was a warning shot. Countries that once helped fuel America's rise are now signaling they may not bankroll its future. The timing was no accident either. The sell-off came right after President Trump escalated his second-term trade war, slapping heavy tariffs on imports from those very same nations. To see why this is so significant, it's worth remembering what U.S. Treasury bonds have represented for decades. They weren't just pieces of government debt. They were the foundation of the global financial system after World War II. In every major crisis, whether it was the Asian financial crash in the 1990s or the global meltdown of 2008, investors flocked to U.S. bonds. They symbolized safety, reliability, and liquidity. Foreign central banks stocked them as the core of their reserves. Pension funds, insurers, and wealth funds treated them as the safest collateral imaginable. That trust gave the United States a financial advantage no other country enjoyed. It allowed Washington to run wars, stimulus programs, and giant deficits without the usual limits most governments face. By the mid-2010s, foreign investors owned nearly one-third of all U.S. debt. In many ways, the world was lending to Washington on generous terms. Foreign governments accepted low interest rates, taking on the risks so that the American economy could keep living beyond its means. China was the heavyweight in this arrangement. Throughout the 2000s, Beijing's trade surpluses poured into U.S. securities. That gave China leverage, but it also tied its own financial health to America's stability. Japan played a similar role, but China's position highlighted the strange paradox. The United States and its top strategic rival were locked together in a tight financial embrace. Over the years, though, that grip has loosened. After Trump's first trade war in 2018 and 2019, Beijing began slowly reducing its holdings. Even so, by 2025, China was still the second largest foreign lender to the U.S. Canada stood at the opposite end of the spectrum, a trusted partner, deeply tied into American trade and financial systems, and a steady buyer of U.S. bonds. Brazil's stake was smaller, but as Latin America's biggest economy, its role carried weight too. Then came Trump's second term and what some have called his tariff earthquake. In April 2025, he declared a national emergency over America's trade deficit and slapped a sweeping 10% baseline tariff on nearly all imports. On top of that came reciprocal duties, some reaching 50%, against countries labeled as unfair traders. Then the penalties got personal. Canada faced tariffs of 35%. Brazil saw duties climb to nearly 50%. And China was hit hard across critical industries. The political pitch was straightforward: make America strong again by forcing others to pay. But the financial fallout was much harsher. The very countries hit hardest on trade had every reason to strike back, not necessarily by imposing their own tariffs, but by going after the foundation of U.S. strength, its debt market. And that's exactly what they did. The July 2025 Treasury report showed just how dramatic the shift had become. Canada's holdings of U.S. debt fell from $438 billion in June to $381 billion in July, a staggering $57 billion drop in a single month. China cut back by $26 billion, reducing its holdings from $756 billion to $730 billion. Brazil trimmed $14 billion, falling from $215 billion to $201 billion. Altogether, nearly $100 billion disappeared from America's debt market in just 1 month. And it all came from the countries hardest hit by tariffs. This wasn't business as usual. It was both retaliation and self-protection. If Washington was willing to weaponize trade, what would stop it from doing the same with finance? By selling off U.S. bonds, these countries were lowering their exposure to a system they no longer fully trusted. For Canada, the move was particularly striking. Long considered one of America's most reliable creditors, Ottawa was suddenly unwilling to fund Washington's deficits while being punished at the border. For China, the message was symbolic as well as financial. Once the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt, Beijing's $26 billion cut was a clear response to Trump's tariffs. Brazil's reduction was smaller in scale, but no less pointed. If the U.S. shut them out of its market, they wouldn't keep lending money to Washington. So where did the money go? Increasingly, into gold. Throughout 2025, central banks have been buying gold at a historic pace. According to the World Gold Council, purchases have already exceeded 1,000 tons this year, one of the largest totals in modern history. China has led the way, adding to its reserves for 9 months in a row by July, bringing its stockpile to nearly 74 million ounces, worth about $244 billion. Brazil, too, has quietly boosted its gold holdings, using bullion as insurance against the dollar's volatility. Worldwide, central banks now account for nearly a quarter of all gold demand, roughly twice the share they held in the early 2010s. The appeal is simple. Gold can't be printed, frozen, or turned into a weapon through sanctions the way U.S. debt can. In an era where America openly uses trade and finance as tools of power, gold looks like a safer bet, not just to U.S. adversaries, but even to some of its allies. Canada, however, remains a notable exception. Canada stands out as an exception in another way. Its official reserves still show zero gold, unchanged from past years, rather than turning to bullion. Ottawa made its point through massive treasury sales. Canadian investors more broadly have also been diversifying, moving money into foreign securities even as the government reduces its exposure to U.S. debt. The larger picture, though, is unmistakable. America's debt continues to soar. Its circle of foreign creditors is shrinking, and both allies and rivals are turning to alternatives, often in the form of gold. For decades, foreign governments bought U.S. treasuries almost without question, helping to keep American borrowing costs low. But the figures from July 2025 show that trust is starting to erode. If demand for treasuries keeps slipping, Washington will have no choice but to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. That would ripple through the entire economy, pushing up mortgage rates, credit card costs, and business loans. It would also force taxpayers to shoulder more of the federal budget, as larger and larger sums are needed just to pay interest on the debt. What began as a tariff campaign meant to protect American workers could backfire, raising costs for the very families it aimed to help. The irony is striking. Tariffs sold as a way to make America stronger have instead given other countries a reason to undermine the core of U.S. power, its ability to borrow cheaply and endlessly. When historians look back, July 2025 may stand out as a turning point, the month when America's trading partners quietly fought back, not by slapping tariffs of their own, but through a silent rebellion in the bond market. And the consequences of that shift are still unfolding. Every ounce of gold China adds to its reserves, every U.S. bond Canada sells, every shift Brazil makes into bullion, all of it points to a deeper trend: the gradual erosion of the dollar's dominance. Once global confidence starts to slip and alternatives gain traction, the system rarely goes back to what it was. The quiet rebellion has already begun. The question is no longer whether America can borrow. It's whether the rest of the world will still be willing to lend. As for this channel, it exists only because of your support. There are no sponsors or safety nets here. If you believe independent voices matter, and that truth should never be for sale, then consider subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Every click sends a message that truth matters, and together, it's the only way this channel can grow, and the only way truth survives.